Welcome to Science Fiction 101. It's the podcast series where we explore science fiction from all angles, past, present and future. We're your hosts. I'm Phil.
And I'm Colin.
And last time we reviewed a 60-year-old issue of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And this time, for comparison, we're going to review the equivalent issue from 2022, travelling back just a month, really, from where we are now. So we'll be asking the question, how has fantasy and science fiction, the magazine, changed in 60 years? Also coming up today, much to Colin's surprise, will be a sci-fi quiz.
Right on.
But first, some reactions to the last episode. Emmanuel, one of our regulars via Twitter, said, as always, a funny and interesting discussion. Thanks to Colin Kusky for the shout-out to my podcast. And then we had Jim via Facebook, who said, I love when you guys review old SF magazines. I hate to wait until next December. Well, that's because I said we were going to do this every year. So, yeah, I'm afraid, Jim, you have to wait till December. He goes on to say, he comments on a number of the review books that we mentioned in passing. As we were leafing through that old magazine, we came across the book reviews, and he says, I'm surprised you all have never heard of The High Crusade by Paul Anderson. And he says, I read A for Andromeda back in the day and really enjoyed it. I had not seen or even heard of the British TV series that it was based on. In the 60s, I sided with Fred Hoyle and backed the steady-state theory over the Big Bang theory, but then they discovered cosmic background radiation. Oh well. And then he makes some comments on that bizarre Fred Pole binary number system that we talked about last time. And finally, Jim says, the December 1962 issue of F&SF does sound like a dud, but I might want to read some of the stories, especially the Gordon-Dixon, but in a sick way to read the weird story about artificial legs that was so sexist. So, thank you, Jim, for reminding us of that not very good story. And then William, via Facebook, said, hey, I listened to the podcast while walking to the library. I think that's a very good use of your time. Says that he really enjoyed it and that he will now go back and listen to earlier episodes. He then makes some observations on science fiction itself. He says, for all its forward-looking nature, science fiction was, and probably still is, a profoundly conservative genre. He says, I was born in 62, and yeah, as was said, the 60s didn't start till later, but in many ways it started earlier. And he points out that the term beatnik was coined in the 50s, for example. And although modernism didn't hit science fiction until the New Wave, it had been a significant force in literary writing since the 20s. He then finishes by saying it just depends on what you were exposed to culturally. I was quite struck by that notion that science fiction is a profoundly conservative genre. And I can see that, but I think sometimes science fiction will start with the familiar and then take us into the unfamiliar. And I think in order to do that, it has to present a somewhat conservative view of the world to begin with, before it then presents something that's a bit off the beaten track, you know?
Yeah. Although this new magazine we reviewed is not conservative, I think, in any standpoint.
I think you're right. So thanks for the feedback, folks. Anytime you have any questions or comments on what we've been talking about or want to join in the discussion, just go to our website, which is 101sf.blogspot.com, and you can post a comment on there. Or, as other people have done, you can find us on Facebook, and you can find me on Twitter. I think, Colin, you're on Twitter as well?
I am.
So you can track us down, and we'll keep an eye out for comments wherever they appear. So, shall we come a bit more up to date then and review the November and December 2022 issue of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction?
Let's do it.
What was your overall feeling before you started reading? What did you feel you were going to be in for with this?
Well, I was reminded of what we did last year, and it's like reading two issues of a magazine all at once because it's published bi-monthly. Because
it was called November-December. I just assumed they weren't publishing it very often, but I think the content in there is kind of 2 months' worth. I think you're certainly getting your money's worth, aren't you?
Yeah. I didn't recognize any of the authors or any of the stories that were mentioned, and that's, a little bit different than what we did for 1952. Mm-hmm. Regarding the art, it's this odd blend of Egyptian and modern-day pirate, maybe?
So there's quite a lot of stories in there. I think we may have to skip over some of them. Shall we talk first of all about Sacrificial Drones by John Shirley? A writer with quite a reputation, is one of the sort of early cyberpunk writers, been going for a good few decades now. I haven't read a huge amount of his work, I have to say, and I don't think I've ever read any lengthy pieces, only short fiction. What did you think of Sacrificial Drones?
I enjoyed it. I think it was one of the more well-written pieces in the entire magazine. I'm a fan of Susan Collins' work, the Gregor the Overlander series, and of course the Hunger Games. And two themes which are central to those stories are the idea that war and violence has really negative effects on people, especially children.
Right.
And so watching the development of one of the main characters at the start of the story and then how he makes decisions throughout the story was really impactful to me. And I was particularly struck by the end of the very beginning and the end of the very ending, because they're exactly the same phrase, talking about the effects of violence and what people tend to take with them because of that. And it's this sentence or phrase, dragging what he or she had seen behind him as if it were attached to his ankles by a rope.
You're saying that was near the beginning as well?
Yeah, so in the story opens with a young boy who watches his parents being killed by a militia.
Yeah.
And that drives him to become one of the most rich and successful inventors in the world. And then he sacrifices his life in order to get revenge on the people that killed his parents. And as part of that process, though, he begins to seduce and fall in love with a young woman, and she creates a technology that enables him to get his revenge at the cost of then losing him and having to witness what went on.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that phrase. I was very taken with it at the end of the story. I think because I read this over a period of a couple of days, I'd probably forgotten that phrase had been used earlier, but I've just found it earlier in the story. And that makes it even stronger than I thought it was. To me, it felt like some good dramatisation, some good dialogue all the way through the piece. And John Shirley is also a screenwriter as well as a novelist and a short story writer, so maybe he sees everything in terms of drama and dialogue and character interaction. It seemed very much a story of today.
Oh, yes.
Simply because of all of the ingredients that were thrown into the mix there. You've got some globalisation, you've got some African and other politics, you've got some terrorism, you've got some gender fluidity, and my note on the final line, I put the final line of the story suggests that all of human experience is terrible baggage that we can never rid ourselves of. And by saying that, it does make the story sound like it's a terrible downer, and in some ways it is, but in other ways it isn't. It's a story I didn't greatly enjoy when I was reading it, but having completed it, I did want to go back and read it again. So, well done, John Shirley, for getting us off to a good start. According to me, the second story was Though the Heavens Fall by Lewis Evans. Mm-hmm. It's a funny little story. It's basically a space opera, but the spaceships are the characters. It's almost as if we're looking at the story from a different level to what we normally would. We would normally look at the level of the characters within the spaceships and see what the characters do. But we're actually going up a level and looking at the spaceships as characters, and the humans, or aliens, whatever it is that's driving the ship, they're just part of their system. And then in terms of what the story is about, there's a conflict between two of the ships over an asylum-seeking cyborg, I think. And then there's an older, wiser ship called Carmine, who acts as a kind of a judge. And I thought the first half of the story was really terrific. There's lovely use of language. So this is a sample paragraph. One ship, a slender blade 1,000 kilometres long, rich in heavy metals, its drive kernel a knotwork of exotic matter. One ship, twin toroids, 2 spun seas, stachyon sails luffing high in the wind that blows ever sideways from hyperwas to never when. It's kind of fantasy language, but you know what it's on about, because it's using terms that reflect our common understanding of the tropes of space opera.
Mm-hmm.
So I quite liked it for the first half of the story, but then I found it became a bit dull when we got to the kind of judgment story.
You know, the language of the story is really rich and enjoyable, but the plot, I think, basically boils down to this. There was one ship, the Sunspire Undaunted, which is crewed by enslaved cyborgs.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the liberated ship, the Happy Hippo, who kind of go, oh, all you poor people in the other ship, you shouldn't be slaves. This is wrong. And then you get Carmine, who gets to come in, and Carmine has some baggage of his own. And then judge between the two. And so on the surface, it's like, well, yeah, we know you're bad and we know that you're right and we're supposed to side with one with the other, but it was kind of, I don't know, trite.
What it boils down to is stylistically, it's really beautiful. But in terms of what the story is, it's basic. But I think that probably means that I would read more from this author.
And this is a newer author. He was first published in 2019.
Right.
And this is his first appearance in fantasy and science fiction. But I'm looking forward to seeing more of his stories.
Good. For the third one, I've got The Shotgun Lucifer by Bennett North.
This was my favorite story in the entire magazine.
Oh, wow.
I like a Western, and I'm not sure why. And so this really interesting mashup of a Western and science fiction, bringing together this whole discovery about how people see things. I think that's the right way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
I almost don't want to spoil this story because I think the reveal was so incredible at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know how to talk about it without doing that. But you have to imagine kind of a Western setup where there's a wagon train going on, and one person is hired to be the Shotgun Lucifer. And that term is never described until the story is almost finished. But what you come to realize is that all of these people are blind, and the only way they see is through reflected sound.
Or, just to be pedantic, is it that they're blind, or is it that this is a dark world where you cannot see things with your eyes?
And I'm not sure.
I think it might be the latter, simply because there is a moment in the story where one of the characters says of another character, oh, she's blind. And for that to be made a feature of one character's perception of another, I think therefore means that they're not all blind.
No, yeah, it's certainly possible that some of them cannot... in my head, I was calling it echolocate.
Yeah. I think we need to say, for the benefit of the listener, and it's not a spoiler because it is indicated from the very beginning of the story, but the basic premise is that things that make sound in our experience are visible to the characters in this story. So, for example, if you've got a horse and its hooves are hitting the ground, the characters see a flash of light, so they are seeing with sound. So, as you say, it's like echolocation.
There is a movie, A Quiet Place.
Oh, yes.
Where the monsters are incredibly sound sensitive. And if I remember right, during the movie at some point, the view kind of switches to where you're seeing things from the monster's point of view. And you see these explosions of light and attention because of the sounds that are going on. And that is exactly the way I pictured this novel after I understood what was going on.
Yeah.
At first, I was kind of confused. Well, why do they have somebody beating the drum going ahead of them? And the answer is, so you can see.
Yeah.
But you are immersed in the story from the characters who are so completely used to this that it isn't worth mentioning to us, the people reading the story.
Yes.
And then it turns out that a ship from Earth has landed with sighted people, and the astronaut has been captured, and she's trying to escape with another member of the wagon train who's also trying to escape her past. And that's where this discussion begins to happen, and the realization that, oh yeah, these people can't see unless there's sound, except for this lady. She can see.
Yeah. And the scenario then becomes this kind of... do you remember that? There's a Star Trek episode, a Next Generation episode, Who Watches the Watchers, where Federation people are observing this alien race, but they're doing it from a hide, like bird watchers go into a hide so that they can observe.
Right.
It's that kind of scenario. It's observing an alien race without them knowing they're being observed. But one of the observers gets caught up in this escape thing. I think we're making this sound like a really complicated story, but it's actually straightforward and elegant. And as you say, it is just like a Western, except for these science fictional elements which turn out to be absolutely central.
And I think that's why it's my favorite, because there is this You think you're watching some kind of a sci-fi Western, and then all of a sudden your entire perspective changes.
Yes. Did you feel when you got to the end, though, that, wait a minute, this is the first chapter of a novel?
If I had been reading this as part of a larger book, I think I definitely would have seen that. But I knew all these were short stories, and one of the hallmarks of a short story is that they usually do not tell an entire story.
Yeah.
It's one act in a larger thing.
I think that the difference, though, is that a good short story kind of tells you the most important act of a character's life, whereas the first chapter of a book kind of knows there are going to be other adventures that are equally important in this character's future. So I think there is a different feeling between a short story and an opening chapter. And to me, this really felt like an opening chapter. I actually wanted to turn the page and see chapter 2. Well,
that is a great recommendation for the story.
I think it is, yeah. So that's The Shotgun Lucifer by Bennett North. And I think we're doing quite well. We're saying positive things about 2 out of 3 stories so far.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth one I've got on my list is Child of Two Worlds.
Yes.
By, and this is where I can't read my own handwriting, is it Vida Cruz Borgia?
Yeah, that sounds right. I have Borja, Borja.
The blurb for this story says that the story itself is set in, quote, the shared world of Hinirang?
Yeah.
A brainchild of Filipino author Dean Francis Alfar. So this is an author building on an existing world, and it's a world that I am not at all familiar with, so that was kind of a point against it, and I'm sorry to say that I couldn't read this story. The first page, I think I read about 4 times trying to make sense of it, because it had a quite complicated sentence with long character names, and I just felt it was really clunky, and it's everything that I dislike in fantasy fiction.
Oh.
How did you feel about it?
This was not one of my more favorite stories. We've been talking on and off over the years about how other cultures have different kinds of science fiction than we have in the West. Even between, the UK and the United States, science fiction tends to be a little different in some ways.
Yeah.
So this is really my first read of, I'm going to call it, foreign fantasy. And it's a very, very interesting take. I was able to read the entire story. I enjoy fantasy quite a bit. But yeah, I was challenged several times because they're borrowing elements from the Filipino culture, which I'm not familiar with. And that pulls me out of a story because it's alien and I don't understand it.
Sure.
And as I was thinking about how to summarize the story, just last night, I was going to say, well, I wish there was some glossary of terms which are unfamiliar to me. Mm-hmm. And then had the realization that I don't feel that way about Western science fiction or fantasy, that I just expect everyone to know all the Western tropes. And so it was very revealing. But yeah, I think it would help everyone if we began to explain some things that we all take for granted. Like at one point, the main character, a young woman, is talking to a guy who's gotten lost and he's been distracted by a fantasy monster. And she says, oh, all you have to do is turn your conga inside out, which I think is a piece of clothing, but it turns out to actually be a beach towel.
As a reader, you're colliding with a word that has no meaning to you. Now, we can often figure out what a word means from context, but the author, to me, is under some obligation to meet the reader halfway by inventing terms which suggest a meaning. And a very good example would be from that previous story that we looked at with the spaceships and that little passage that I read out when it was talking about hyper-when and never was. Those are made-up terms, but they're made up of little parts of words that carry meaning. So even though we don't know what never was is, it comes with some very strong connotations.
Yes.
But if it is a completely made-up term, then it becomes a bit of a brick wall. Now, some people love that. I know many people who read fantasy who love being challenged in that way, and they see it as part of the fun. Personally, I always feel that the writer doesn't care about me as a reader because they're putting up this barrier between. The use of footnotes is one way out of that. Mm-hmm. But I see that as a failing of me as much as a failing of the author, because I'm coming to the story ill-prepared for what the story is doing. But would you recommend it?
Yeah, it's not a bad story at all. It's not one of my favorites,
Right.
And like I said, it challenged me because it made me realize I don't know anything about Filipino science fiction or fantasy.
Yeah. Now, after that, I came across a number of poems, and with all respect to the authors of those poems, I'm not interested in poetry, so I skipped them. Did you bother reading the poems?
No, I did the same.
Sorry, folks, but yeah, we're not poetry fans. Similarly, I skipped the book reviews. Well, I did actually skim through to see which books they were reviewing, but because they weren't reviewing anything that I was familiar with, I thought there's no real point in commenting on those. Unlike what we did last time, when we looked at the 50-year-old issue, the book reviews sometimes were reviewing things that I was familiar with, so I thought it was worth commenting there. But in this case, I don't know any of the works. Did you come across any that you knew?
No.
No.
No, they're all recently published, and I guess I'm not that up to date in my science fiction, unless it's the authors that I really like and tend to follow.
Yeah. The next story, I've got Optimist Cleaver's Last Transmission.
Yes.
Yep. By J.C. Hsu, who is a Taiwanese-American author. And I have to say, from that title, I was put in mind of Senior So-and-so's fake leg from last time.
Quite a different story, though.
It is. So what was this one about? I've put a few notes down here. I've said it's sort of a cyberpunky post-apocalyptic story about messengers in New Angeles, as opposed to Los Angeles. One of the messengers has gone missing and is feared dead. Oh, then I wrote, I got bored with this. Ooh. The story was well enough structured that I could kind of anticipate what was coming next. But to me, it was very slow in then getting through those next steps. And it was almost as if some of the scenes could have been seriously abbreviated and still have the story have the same effect. What were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, this wasn't a bad story.
Mm-hmm.
If I was looking for a comparison, I would say it kind of reminded me of The Matrix.
Yeah.
Kind of reminded me of Black Rain with Michael Douglas.
Oh, yes.
Or maybe, oh goodness, what's the Michael Crichton book?
There are so many.
Yeah, it's one of his non-science fiction ones. It had Wesley Snipes in it.
Oh, is it Rising Sun?
Rising Sun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to put the author down because I think there is some good writing in there. I thought there was some interesting characterization and some good dialogue and some interesting characters that we were introduced to. But I just felt that the storytelling wasn't quite efficient enough for my tastes. But strangely enough, I thought another story in the same magazine did a similar kind of thing, but much more effectively because the author was better at kind of varying the pace.
I love the fact that Optimus Cleaver is actually a character's name, and I like the derivation of it.
Yeah, I like the fact also that the characters have short names as well. So am I right in thinking Optimus Cleaver was referred to as Tim?
Yes.
Yeah, and the same thing happens with other characters as well. So I think it's nicely done. It's sort of giving characters a science fictional name, but recognising that in real life people reduce a name down to its shortest possible form.
Oh, Tim is from Optimist.
Yeah, I assume. Yeah.
See, I thought that because that Optimus had left their previous life behind, that they had adopted a new name, but that's not the case at all.
Oh, okay. I mean, that might be true as well, but I'm just going to look up the other character names because I've forgotten who they were. Oh, yeah, there's a character called Pug, which is short for pugilist. Yeah, there's a character called Kipium or Kipium. I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it, but their name is shortened to Kip.
Yep.
Yeah, so it seems to be a thing that people go by shortened names, like Phil.
Now, see, being called Colin, that was never a problem for me, or never an issue for me.
What's the next one? Is it Cryptocurrency by Sarah Ellis?
Yeah, this is urban fantasy. So it's fantasy told in the modern day, and we're dealing with a grave robber who ends up trying to save somebody's life who is being sold into slavery. Mm-hmm. And things go very badly, and the main character ends up getting saved by her estranged father, who's an assassin.
Yeah, and it's all to do with magic, isn't it? It's not science fiction, but I think it uses magic in a science fictional way. I think it uses the terminology of spells and incantations and all of that in the same way that science fiction uses made-up terms. I mean, I think this is the opposite of what I was referring to earlier on, people using terminology and tropes as a barrier. This one very much is using very familiar tropes, but from magic. I suppose you might say it's a Harry Potter influence, but I think that might be a bit of an insult to the author.
Maybe. Yeah, but I think you could easily rewrite this story using technology instead of magic.
Yeah.
And it could very easily be exactly the same story.
Yes. This one, I think, is the one that I thought bore a little bit of resemblance to Optimist Cleaver, in the way that there's a kind of a character with a mission, and there's a bit of a mystery, and it doesn't take long for you to figure out where the story might be going. But in this case, it does it very cleanly and very efficiently, and I was very engaged with this. And it did have some sort of science fictional trappings, because it talks about cryptocurrencies, and indeed the title is a play on words, isn't it? It's called cryptocurrency rather than cryptocurrency. It refers to streaming media and so on. So I thought all that was good. At the end of the day, though, I'm not really sure what the story's about. I mean, I know what it's about in terms of plot, but it was kind of a so what? What are you telling me about the human condition? It was my feeling at the end of the story. So it's a very nice piece of storytelling, but I don't know if there's much point.
No, I think this one, well, hard to tell. For me, it was entertaining.
Yeah.
But there weren't any like huge reveals. There weren't any morals or ethics. There was.
Yeah.
It was an interesting story.
Yeah. The next one I've got is Iconophobe by
Sam J. Miller.
Thank you. In my notes I put, it's about a suicidal cult which follows a Susan Sontag-style cultural critic, and they believe that photography's ruined civilization, and they talk about the rupture as being that moment in human history when photography was invented, and everything's gone to pot since. I thought it was very interesting that this story was set in the past and not in the era of digital imagery. I think that makes the story more plausible in its own terms, but I think it made me wonder about how accurate the observations, the kind of the implied cultural criticism that the story is making, how accurate that is, given that photographic images are totally surrounding us now.
Yeah, I didn't like this story very much. The central premise is that this reporter infiltrates a cult in order to do a piece on it, doesn't believe it, and then comes to find out later that everything they said is right. Yeah. Part of me just wants to reject that, no, cults are bad, cults are wrong. And to me, setting it in the past actually gave it, like you said, kind of a higher veneer of believability, because the 60s and the 70s was a time with a lot of cults in them.
Yeah, I think it has to be set in that sort of time period for just historical plausibility, I suppose. It seemed to be about something, whereas my criticism of the previous story is that it wasn't really about anything. I mean, this one seems to be a bit about survivor guilt, as well as this Susan Sontag-inspired idea that photography has changed everything. Here's a note I put: our protagonist journeys from skepticism to true believer, although he doesn't get to progress to heaven, in quotes. So the character of Hannah, her philosophy is vindicated, which is really what you were saying just now, isn't it? Yes.
And to me, that was the big, like, oh my goodness, this is true. It's all real. It's like, oh, yuck.
A bit of a challenging story in many ways. My final note I've put, not sure it's a pleasant read.
Yeah. This magazine does not shy away from having horror.
No, that's true.
And we're about to see that in the next couple of stories.
Yeah. I think that's one of the strengths of the magazine. There's quite a bit of diversity in the range of styles that they accept, and the topics they accept, and the approaches. And things can be dreadfully serious, or they can be very light and fluffy, and the magazine allows all of that. I really like that about F&SF. where do we get to next? We get to one, To Carve Home in Your Bones. Is that the next one you've got?
Yes.
Yeah. And I have to apologise because I haven't read it. I ran out of time and I saw that was one of the longer pieces, so I totally skipped it. So I've got literally nothing to say about it.
Yeah, I didn't finish it because it was really unpleasant. I don't mind horror. I enjoy a lot of horror in certain ways, but there's a certain degree of it that I don't care for.
So is it best to just skip this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that one was called To Carve Home in Your Bones by, I'm afraid to pronounce the name because I'm going to pronounce it wrongly, Anye? Do you think that's the first name?
Could be.
Anyway, to the author of To Carve Home in Your Bones, we do apologise. We ran out of time. Well, I ran out of time. Next story, Skin of the Beast.
Did you read this one?
I did.
Yeah, short, sweet little piece with a lot of punch in it.
Yeah.
I wrote as a quick overview of it, putting truth to the saying that clothes make the man or woman, even when lycanthropy is involved.
Ooh, very good. That's a nice little log line there. This one's by Alexandra Flores, who I don't know anything about, really. And yeah, my note is simple fairy tale style story of a woman who takes control over her beast of a husband. I don't know, is this a spoiler to say by butchering him and taking on his literal mantle?
Yeah, although given what happens, I wasn't sure that she killed him and butchered him. She just kind of
skinned him.
Yeah, skinned him alive, but then she puts on the skin and becomes what he had been.
That's right. Yeah.
So, I think this has a lot to say about, toxic masculinity and gender roles.
Yep.
And strong women, because she talks about, she knows what she's doing because she's experienced with a knife and a needle.
Yes.
Really enjoyable little story, even with the horror in it.
Yeah, I thought it was one of the more effective pieces. Then we had some more poems. And then, the next story I've got is Santa Knows by Joe Miles, which is a little piece of fluff as far as I'm concerned. It's a light Christmas story. There's a tech company which makes the all-seeing, all-judgmental Santa Knows app. And the company and its owner are taught a lesson by the real Santa Claus, who kind of teaches what the real spirit of Christmas is, rather than judging children.
Yeah, so I thought it was nice that during Christmas they had an actual Christmas story.
Yeah, me too. They could have put it on the cover, couldn't they? Oh
my goodness, yeah. Can you imagine, a little kid being, looking at their phone and being horrified by what is telling them about them? And
yeah.
I wrote, Team Santa tries to stop the trauma caused by a technological elf on the shelf.
Oh, very good. Are you a copywriter?
Maybe I should be.
Maybe you should. I put a note saying they could have made this a story with some kind of parallel to religious belief, or about a bad character made that way by a bad childhood. But they don't do that. They don't do any of the things that I thought the story could have done. So in the end, it's not really about anything other than just being a fun little Christmas story. I thought it could have had more depth to it, but there's nothing wrong with it in terms of what it is, and it's one of those that I can imagine is going to come back every year. It could become one of those little perennial classics.
Yeah, I mean, aside from a pretty strong condemnation of social media and big tech,
50 years from now, people are going to say, back in the 2020s, they were obsessed with their Elon Musks and their Zuckerbergs and the self-made tech millionaires, or billionaires, I should say.
Yeah.
So the next thing I've got is a non-fiction article called By the Numbers.
I'm ashamed to say this is something I've actually thought as I've been watching the nominations for the Hugo, the Nebulas, and the other awards, where there's been this huge swing from where things were dominated by men to being, I'm going to say, to exaggerate, dominated by women and people that are non-binary.
Yeah.
They just lay out all the evidence that shows that's exactly what is happening, although they make a reason for it.
Right.
That, authors that are not, white males from the United States are making incredible science fiction and fantasy, and people are being more well-read than they used to be. And the voting population for these is much larger than it used to be.
Absolutely.
And so it's a bellwether. And I think eventually at some point we'll start to see where there isn't such a huge influence of gender on either side on the quality of what's being written.
Yeah. It's something we've talked about on the podcast, isn't it? And something that we've both felt is a very positive thing. That the genre, the field has really broadened in recent times, certainly over the last decade. But it's interesting to see somebody putting some numbers on it. And I was wondering whether we might want to come back to this article in a future episode and maybe talk about it in more detail.
Yeah, I'd like that. Although I'm not sure why on 2020 and 2021 they had no data for the Hugos.
Ah, interesting. I didn't twig that. Let's come back to it. Let's have another read of it, and then we can talk about it either next time or in a future episode.
Okay.
The next one I've got is Water Music by Michael Gonzalez. I've got a log line for this, nowhere near as poetic as yours, I have to say. I've got a budding young jazz musician somehow finds inspiration from Mononji, that's my guess is how you pronounce it, a creature in a nearby lake. And then I wrote, not my cup of tea. So,
yeah.
I didn't think much of this. I think it's mostly to do with the milieu, if I may use a fancy word. It's more the sort of the setting, the trappings of the jazz field and the jazz clubs and the music and all the references to jazz musicians. It just leaves me cold, and therefore I don't feel any interest. I think there's some good attempts at characterisation of the central character here, and going back and showing him in his childhood and then what becomes of him as an adult musician. I found myself getting rather bored with it and skimming.
Yeah. So I wrote this, to summarize this, musician gets inspiration from his biggest fan, a local water monster. But sometimes fans are very demanding. In December, we took a family trip to New York, and one of the stops on our trip was the Blue Note, which is world-renowned for jazz.
Right.
So I was a little more familiar with this, and my family does music. We're all musicians of various levels and interests.
Yeah.
Jazz really isn't my thing, but both my sons have played jazz and really enjoyed it. Huh. But yeah, it's a fantasy story with a little bit of horror towards the end.
What about creatures from Black Lagoon? So, do you have experience of those?
Well, I grew up in Oregon, and Oregon is known for having Sasquatch.
Oh, okay.
And when I was a little kid, a latchkey kid, I was terrified that there was a Sasquatch watching me in the woods out my back door. Because as like I mentioned, I grew up in a small town, miles outside the small town, on 5 acres of woods, all by ourselves. So,
did you take any photos?
No, I did not have a camera.
Oh, okay.
I didn't get a camera until I was 13 or 14.
Because you see, I think you're missing a trick there. You could have got us some Sasquatch photos and you'd be famous by now.
Yeah, someone would have said, hey kid, you're afraid of branches waving in the breeze and shadows.
Now, just going back to the table of contents, just to see whether we've covered everything. We skipped the story to Carve Home in Your Bones.
Yes.
We've talked about all the other short stories. We've skipped all the poems, and we've more or less skipped all the departments, as they call it.
Although, 40, 50, 60 years in time, fantasy and science fiction has all the same departments that it used to have.
Yes. And it looks fairly similar, doesn't it? I mean, it does. The sort of the typography and the little, they have a little icon that appears at the end of each story just to signify that it's the end. I don't know if that is the same as it was 50 years ago, but it feels like it is, I don't know of any other magazine that feels as similar now as it did in the 50s or 60s as this one.
Yeah, and staying true to form, there are a variety of authors, men, women, maybe people of other genders, although that's not explicitly discussed in author bios. Yeah. There are international authors. There's a variety of stories. It's got poetry, which is a new addition.
Yeah.
We didn't talk very much about the science piece, which was all about the color blue.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's another piece that I skipped. Yeah. But again, that matches the layout of the 50-year-old issue where we had those articles about computing. So, yeah, in terms of its overall mission as a magazine, it does still seem very similar to what they were doing 50 years ago. I think that's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, particularly with, and I wanted to mention this quickly, Galaxy's Edge, which was by Mike Resnick, is closing as a magazine and moving to an anthology format, which means I think maybe yearly or bi-yearly they'll collect a bunch of stories and publish those, which is essentially what these magazines are doing.
Yeah. So overall, you think it was a positive experience reading this issue?
Yeah. I mean, for me, there were some ups and some downs.
Yeah.
Some things I really liked, some things, one thing I didn't finish reading.
I was quite pleased and quite impressed. Unlike the one from 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, which I was disappointed by. Which brings me to the question of, do you have a ranking order? I think you mentioned one of the stories was your favourite. But could you do a top 3?
Oh, yeah, easily. My favorite was Shotgun Lucifer.
Mm-hmm.
I think my second favorite was Optimus Cleaver's Last Transmission, just because it was a fun read with a lot of action, maybe a little long, not too bad. And I would follow that by Sacrificial Drones, which was just a lovely story that I still like. And I kind of liked Cryptocurrency as well.
Okay, we're pretty much on the same wavelength then, because I've got Sacrificial Drones as my top story. And I think if I read it a second time, it would reinforce that. In second place, I've got Shotgun Lucifer. And in third place, I've got Cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Yeah, very impressed by fantasy and science fiction. I used to read it back in the day. I had a subscription at some point in the 90s. And I only stopped subscribing because I reached the point where I wasn't able to read every issue. They would arrive through the letterbox faster than I could read them.
Oh, wow.
So I gave up. But it's good to go back and find that it is still essentially the same magazine, even though obviously we've gone through a whole generation of authors, a couple of generations of authors since the 60-year-old issue that we looked at last time. I think it's great. And if there were a physical issue readily available to me, I think I would pick up a physical copy and I'd happily read it on a train or a plane.
Yeah, I like that on the EPUB that I bought, it has the barcode with pricing in it for the United States and the UK. And also says, display until January 2nd.
Oh, fantastic. Shall we move on to something else?
What do you have for me?
I have a quiz. This is from Radio Times. Now, Radio Times is, I suppose, the British equivalent of TV Guide.
Oh, okay.
The only reason it's called Radio Times is because it was invented before television, and so it was called Radio Times in the days of radio. And then when television came along, they still called it Radio Times, and it still exists with that title. Anyway, this is called 20 Sci-Fi and Fantasy Questions for your home pub quiz. Well, we don't have a home pub, but we can have the quiz. I've actually gone through it and weeded out the less sci-fi questions. So instead of 20, I'm left with, I think, 13.
Okay.
Maybe for the listener, I should mention that as we record this, it's Friday the 13th of January, 2023. So 13 questions for Friday the 13th. Some of these are really easy.
Okay, good. I'll feel smart.
Question 1. Which character speaks the first line in the original 1977 Star Wars movie?
Speaks.
Yes.
I don't know.
I can give you a clue.
Okay, I'm going to make the face guess, which is Darth Vader.
No.
Okay. In that case, I don't think... I want to say it's some unknown rebel spaceship operator.
Not according to this quiz, no. According to this quiz, it's C-3PO.
Obviously, I need to go back and rewatch Star Wars.
Well, of course. And make sure you watch all of the prequels and sequels as well.
Oh. Okay.
Question 2. Captain James Kirk is the most famous captain of the USS Enterprise in Star Trek, as you may have heard. But who had the job before him?
That would have been Captain Pike.
Correct. Question 3. When Doctor Who came back to TV in 2005, it filmed under a secret code name. What was that code name?
Oh, now that code name, I don't know.
Ah, okay. The code word was Torchwood, which is an anagram of Doctor Who, and it also, of course, is the title of a spin-off TV series.
Right, with John Barrowman.
Yeah, exactly. Question 4. Which animated cartoon scientist's catchphrase is, and I quote, "Wubba lubba dub dub"?
Animated cartoon scientist. Yep. Wubba lubba dub dub.
Yep.
Wubba lubba dub dub. I don't know this one.
Perhaps I'll just tell you.
Yeah.
It's Rick from Rick and Morty.
I have never seen Rick and Morty.
Question 5. Some of these I have to take on faith because I don't necessarily have... Well, I haven't necessarily seen some of these things myself, such as this one. What is the superhero alter ego of the character Billy Batson?
Billy Batson is Shazam.
Correct. It says here in brackets, may accept Captain Marvel.
Yeah, that's the DC alternate Captain Marvel. Yeah.
Question 6. Name just one, of sci-fi author Isaac Asimov's 3 rules of robotics. It says here. I would have said 3 laws, but they say 3 rules.
3 rules.
Name any one.
A robot through action or inaction may not allow a human to come to harm.
That'll do. And that one is law number...
I believe that's law number 1.
Yeah. Question 7. In what year did the Daleks first appear in Doctor Who?
Oh, goodness. I'm going to guess and say 73?
No. 63.
63?
Yeah. I think, if I remember correctly, I think Doctor Who debuted on the very same day that JFK was assassinated.
I didn't know that.
But there were no Daleks in that first episode. They came along a little bit later, but in the same year. So, wow. 63.
So a lot of that Doctor Who famous, mythology has been around from the very beginning. They weren't added later, so to say.
Yeah. That's right. Question 8. Complete the following famous quote from the TV series Lost in Space. Danger, blank, blank.
Will Robinson.
Correct. Question 9. In 2001, A Space Odyssey, what song does the rogue computer system HAL sing to himself as he's shut down?
Isn't it Daisy, Daisy, How Does My Garden Grow?
Daisy, Daisy... it is Daisy, it's Daisy. Yeah, it's not How Does My Garden Grow, though. Daisy, Daisy. Give me your answer, do. That's it.
Yeah.
Question 10. How old was Jedi Master Yoda when he died in Star Wars Return of the Jedi?
Oh, goodness. It's a semi-large 3-digit number. It's 650, 690?
Oh, I think that's good enough. It says here 900.
Oh, 900.
Yeah. But who's counting? Question 11. In the film Jurassic Park, what is the name of the island where the park is located?
Isla Nublar.
Correct. Question 12. In the Alien movie series, what is the name of Ripley's pet cat?
Oh, goodness. I have forgotten.
Jonesy.
Jonesy.
Yeah. And question 13. What exactly is Deep Space Nine in the television series Star Trek Deep Space Nine?
Oh, it's a space station orbiting the planet Bajor.
It is, yes. And you could get bonus points for saying a former Cardassian space station.
Yeah.
Let's see how many you got right.
9? 8.
I'm counting up how many you got wrong. I think you got 6 wrong, and therefore you got 7 right. But you certainly get a bonus point for knowing that Deep Space Nine orbits Bajor. So, yes, you did very well there, Colin. And, of course, the ones you slipped up on, a couple of them were British science fiction things. So you had an unfair disadvantage.
Yeah, but Doctor Who is internationally known.
Well, there is that.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious about one of the ones that you pruned out.
But they were all to do with fantasy things. There was one about Game of Thrones. Oh, Lord of the Rings. So they were all non-science fiction.
I might have done okay on those. Although Game of Thrones, I only read the first book.
I took them out not to give you any kind of advantage or disadvantage. It's simply because they're not consistent with what this podcast is about.
No, we're science fiction.
Yeah. Shall we do a quick run-through of past, present and future?
Yes.
For past, I'm just going to recommend that anybody who's into Ray Bradbury takes a look at the short story Rocket Summer from 1947, which is not the same as the opening chapter of the Martian Chronicles. They both happen to be called Rocket Summer, but the short story is totally unrelated. I've read it recently because I recorded it for my other podcast. It happens to be out of copyright due to some slip-up in the copyright renewals department. So take a look at Bradbury 100 and you'll find it there. Just slipping a little plug for my other podcast there.
Oh, yeah, you should. I picked up at a library book sale the book Back to the Moon by Homer J. Hickam Jr.
Oh, right.
It's an entertaining story. It's kind of like the Apollo murders, I think, though. I love the idea of taking the space shuttle to the moon. Yeah, it's not a great book. Let me just put it that way.
But a good one.
Yeah.
He wrote something else, didn't he? Because I know the name. The October Boys or something?
Well, the movie is October Sky. But yeah.
October Sky.
Yeah. And that one is at least semi-autobiographical.
Yes. I'm going to file this one under present, and I'm going to make a controversial claim.
Uh-oh.
But something I recommend. I don't know if you've seen Glass Onion, the film Glass Onion.
No, I haven't yet.
It's very good. Better than the film that it is a kind of sequel to. I was thoroughly entertained by Glass Onion. Why am I talking about it? Because it's a murder mystery.
Yeah.
Well, I maintain, having seen it, that it is science fiction. And the reason is the story actually hinges upon something called Clear, spelt with a K, Clear, which is a dangerous hydrogen-based fuel that's just been invented. The whole murder mystery hinges on that, and the outcome of the story hinges on it. So it's science fiction. There.
Wow. Now, Knives Out is actually a Kusky family favorite. Everybody likes that movie. So if you say this is better, I guess we're going to have to get Netflix for a month.
I like Knives Out as well. I've only seen it the once, but yeah, I think it's very good. But I think this is better. I felt it was more focused on the... I've forgotten the name of the character now.
Benoit Blanc.
Yes, Benoit Blanc. It's more about him than Knives Out was, and I think that's a really good move.
For my present... I read the first book from the Brandon Sanderson Secret Books Kickstarter called Tress of the Emerald Sea, and that's actually been publicly released now by title, so I can say that.
Terrific.
It's fantasy, but it's a wonderful book. So if you enjoyed the Princess Bride movie, you should get yourself a copy and enjoy it.
I remember you talking about the Kickstarter when it first was set up, and then talking about looking forward to these books being released. So it started to become real now. Yeah,
and interestingly enough, and this is actually impacting science fiction and fantasy as a larger community, Brandon has designed this Kickstarter's fulfillment because he believes that Amazon and Audible have an unhealthy monopoly and influence on the genre and book publishing and audiobook publishing at large.
Yeah.
So he has a particular axe to grind, and he is trying to get more companies into providing books and audiobooks for a healthier ecosystem for authors to work with. So I'm left with the difficult choice of trying to choose between Spotify and Speechify for listening to audiobooks from him, and I still haven't chosen yet. The other recent thing, which I do want to mention, which is definitely science fiction, is from the Washington Post. Did you see that article just from a few days ago?
What was it about?
It was the most influential science fiction.
Now I saw the headline, but it was the Washington Post is one of those that blocks you out if you don't have a subscription.
As a subscriber to the Washington Post, I can gift you the article.
Okay.
Which is a really nice feature.
Okay.
I'll just give a brief summary of it. And so this is one author's opinion of what he has seen as the most impactful science fiction on culture and technology. So, and he quickly names Star Trek, Robert Heinlein, Asimov with the Foundation series in particular, and The Martian.
You did say Star Trek, didn't you?
I did.
Not Star Wars. So I approve. And that's it. I was expecting a long list, like a top 10 or something.
No, it was pretty short, which either tells me that, well, I don't know what it tells me. That maybe they went for the high side of things, but they're certainly the more popular of things.
And in many ways quite traditional.
Yes.
I mean, I'm very, very male, very white. Future items. I struggled to think of a good future item. So all I can come up with is kind of flogging a dead horse, I suppose. Picard Season 3 is coming out next month. And I know, every time there's a new season of Star Trek Picard, I get all excited, and then about 3 episodes in, I'm banging my head against a wall saying, what are they doing? This is rubbish. So Season 3 is coming, and it looks really good. They've got all of the cast of the original TNG series coming back for this season, and there are some interesting things there. So, for example, Worf, the character Worf, he's now old and grey. He looks very distinguished. All of his hair has gone white. But it looks terrific, having seen the trailer. But from 2 seasons of this, I know that the storytelling can be terrible in Picard. But nevertheless, I shall be there in February watching it and hoping for the best.
For the future, I'm... So I follow John Scalzi and several other authors, science fiction and fantasy authors on Twitter and other social media. Mm-hmm. And recently, Mr. Scalzi has been talking about his newest novel, which is called Starter Villain, and kind of the journey his books have taken the last couple of years and the struggles that he has gone through from the pandemic and having COVID himself. Mm. And I'm wondering if for the next 1, 2, maybe 5 years, if we're going to see some incredibly different science fiction come out, having been influenced by that and by people that have been influenced by the pandemic and the coronavirus.
Because when we look back, it's sort of big turbulent moments in history like, World War II, the Cold War, and we see how those had a big influence on what the field did and the themes that the field of science fiction adopted. In a way, it would be great to live through something like that. I'm not saying to live through a pandemic. I don't want another pandemic, but it would be good to live through the time in which the field is responding to something traumatic.
Yeah, like it'd be interesting to see if there's a bunch of science fiction that's written about fear of vaccines or the potentially science fiction effects of vaccines or whatever it comes from that.
Yeah. Very good. I think our time once again has run away with us. So I think we're going to have to wrap up now. But
okay.
I hope our listeners have enjoyed our romp through a modern magazine for a change. And I must say I feel very positive about the magazine that we've read this time. Quite the opposite of the way I felt after we reviewed an old magazine last time. But I think it's something we'll do again in the future. And I think there's a couple of things that we will pick up from this issue of fantasy and science fiction and go into more depth in a future episode. Thanks, Colin. And thanks, listeners. We hope you'll join us next time. We're Phil and Colin. Our theme tune is from purpleplanet.com. Look for the show notes on our website 101sf.blogspot.com, where you can also buy us a coffee through the tip jar. And you can also find us as Science Fiction 101 on Facebook. So thanks everyone, and see you next time.